Good morning. I hope you're not feeling too hot and sweaty this morning, though. I tell you, if you do, then I'm afraid that in this 200-year-old stone building, I guarantee you it's going to be a lot cooler in here than it is out there. So probably the best you're going to do. The book of Ruth, which Julie read so nicely to us there, a lot happens in 4 chapters. It's really saturated with a lot of historical context, a lot of drama, tragedy, and later on, romance, but you'll have to come back next week for that. Because the book of Ruth is so saturated with so much information, I would really like to just have a little recap from last week. Helen preached on chapter 1 last week, and she preached very, very nicely. She took us through a lot of the context and the setup of the book, and I'd just like to remind us of some of that now. So we learned in chapter 1 that an Israelite family who were facing great hardship during a famine had moved from Judah in Israel over to Moab. Now, this wasn't a simple move. This wasn't like, say, you may move from Chatham to Strood or from Raynham to Gravesend or something. Oh no, this is a much bigger deal, folks. Moab was historically the enemy nation of Israel. So effectively, they defected from one nation to its enemy nation. Unfortunately, upon their move, things didn't improve for the family. And the father, Elimelech, he dies, very sadly. And he leaves the mother, Naomi, who's mentioned in the chapter, as a widow. Now, their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, in the family, they go on to marry 2 Moabite women. One named Orpah and one named Ruth, which the book is named after. But unfortunately, tragedy strikes again, and soon those 2 sons pass away as well. So Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth are all now widowed. Now, fast forward a little bit of time, word begins to get around in Moab that the famine that they fled in Israel is beginning to subside. So Naomi sees no reason to remain in Moab as her sons and her husband have died. So she begins to head back to Judah. She tells Ruth and Orpah, in the middle of the last chapter, her daughters-in-law, not to go with her. She said, return to your mother's houses instead. This wasn't because she didn't like them. This was because she knew that being a widow in Israel and a foreigner in Israel as well, she knew that this would leave them very vulnerable to poverty and to hardship. So initially, they both insist on joining Naomi. Orpah and Ruth just say, no, we're not going to leave you. But for the second time of asking, Orpah does reluctantly leave and return to her people. But Ruth didn't. We heard last week, didn't we? Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Ruth knew that doing the right thing was not going to be the easy thing to do. Now, we can't condemn Orpah for leaving and choosing to remain with her people. She was more likely to have security there in her own country than as a Moabite in hostile territory. But despite the great personal risk, Ruth's love, her loyalty, and her devotion to her mother-in-law prevails, and they travel to Bethlehem together. Now, before I go any further, I want to say a little something about biblical interpretation. Our Bible, every chapter and every verse of it, exists to serve a purpose. They're not just random stories recorded in an ancient book. All of it, even though much of it was compiled hundreds, even thousands of years before Jesus walked the earth, all of it can be read as if he is at the very center of it. The Bible was purposely crafted throughout time and history to point us to the person of Jesus Christ. The book of Ruth predates Christ by several hundred years, at least. But isn't it as if his fingerprints are all over it? Doesn't that great personal sacrifice that Ruth made in chapter 1 remind you of the sacrifice Jesus made for us. It's not in Ruth's interests to stay at all, but she does out of love. It was not in Jesus' personal interests at all to go to the cross for us, but he did out of love. But it isn't just Ruth we see the loving essence of Christ within. As we see in chapter 2, we are introduced to a man named Boaz. Now, chapter 2, this is where reality really starts to bite. Ruth, who has taken the decision to go with Naomi, who has very few options, even as a former citizen of Israel. Ruth is a stranger in a foreign land. So we ask, how will they make ends meet? How will they eat? How will they survive? Well, enter Boaz. We're told in verse 1 that he's a kinsman of Naomi. And now, a kinsman means a male relative of somebody. So he's a male relative of Naomi through her deceased husband Elimelech. He's an in-law. So Ruth sets out to glean in some nearby fields. If you don't know what gleaning is, I'll explain. To glean is to gather leftover grains in a field after the harvest had taken place. And this was a special provision allowed under the law of God in the book of Deuteronomy as a very primitive sort of welfare system. Rather than having something like universal credit today where you get money to buy the basics, farmers were instructed not to strip their fields completely bare and leave the spare grains for those who needed them, such as people like Ruth and people like Naomi. Now, Ruth is showing great bravery here because as a stranger in a foreign land, and in the days of the judges, where sin and danger was rampant at every corner, she would have been very vulnerable to attack. Now, by chance, she sets foot onto Boaz's land. She could have encountered anybody at that point, but instead she encounters Boaz and his servants, whose first words to her weren't, "Get out of my field, leave immediately." The first words were, "The Lord be with you." Not only does he let her continue what she's doing, he also says, "Don't glean in another field." Once again, we see an example of someone going the extra mile because of their love and because of their integrity. Just as Ruth didn't have to help Naomi, Boaz didn't have to take care of Ruth. By telling the other men not to bother her and let her drink from the same vessels as his servants, he's really going the extra mile for her. May not sound like much now, but in those days it was. And Ruth is stunned by his kindness. She falls to her knees, humbly asking, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, wherein I am a foreigner?" And here the big reveal comes. He answers her and says, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and under whose wings you have taken refuge." So Ruth is now allowed to glean as much as she needs to, and even have some left over. While Ruth and Naomi eat together, she tells Naomi about Boaz, who then reveals to her that he is one of her in-laws, one of her relatives. And then from then on, she gleans in his field, and she sticks to that field alone, where she's safe, where she is protected, and where she will get all the nourishment and sustenance that she needs. And as I said, Boaz didn't need to do any of that. But like Ruth did in the previous chapter, he did the right thing, even though it wasn't the easy thing. The easy thing would have been to tell her to go away. He did the right thing, not the easy thing. And God honors that in all of our lives. However hard our circumstances are, when we operate with integrity and when we have faith in God, even if that faith is as small as a mustard seed, even if your faith feels really weak right now, if you feel like you don't fully understand all of this, if you don't trust it, God just needs that tiny bit and he can work wonders. He meets you where you are at, and he will work for our good out of what we can offer. This teaches us that we must keep trusting and hoping in God, even when the odds seem stacked against us. Ultimately, my friends, hope in God costs nothing more than our time. Hope in God costs nothing more than our time. Now, I keep mentioning God's work here, but something really curious about the book of Ruth is that God is not seen or heard directly in the book of Ruth at all. Instead, he's quietly working for everybody's good in the background. As we've heard last week, he uses Ruth's integrity to facilitate support to Naomi as she navigates her way through grief and potential destitution in Israel. He uses Boaz's integrity in this chapter to facilitate support for Ruth as she seeks out food and safety. And in the following 2 weeks, you're going to hear about a complete reversal of fortune that God engineers for them all. You know, it's a little bit like that song that we sing here quite a lot, Waymaker. Even when I don't see you, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. That song sums up what God is doing right here in the background of the book of Ruth. So, one really important point that we can take from this is that God's integrity and goodness has transformed and continues to transform our lives. God makes the first move. He invites us with his offer of redemption. And once we have accepted that offer, he invites us to serve him by serving others. He invites us to love. But what's the nature of that love? And what does the Bible have to say about the nature of that love? Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. As you reflect on that checklist of what it means to love, I want you to ask yourselves, what loving qualities do you have that God can use in the way that he used the loving qualities of Ruth to bless Naomi, in the way that he used the loving qualities of Boaz to bless Ruth? What loving qualities do you aspire to develop that God could use in you? How else can God use the love you have to meet the needs of those around you? God can use anything that is born out of love because God is love. But because love does not coerce and love does not control, because love is free, God hasn't programmed his people like robots to behave in a certain way. We have choice and free will to behave in a good way or a bad way. So it's our responsibility as Christians to listen to God, to allow him to prune us into the best versions of ourselves so that we are better equipped to love, serve, and help others, just as Ruth did and just as Boaz did. And by pursuing righteousness, thirsting after righteousness, as Christ phrases it in the Sermon on the Mount. And I've said thirst now, and I need to take a drink. Yeah. Feel free to take one yourselves if you want. Not from my bottle, but... But by thirsting after righteousness, as Christ phrases it, we will bit by bit begin to lay the foundations of the kingdom of God here on earth. Ruth thirsted after righteousness and wouldn't abandon Naomi in her hour of desperation. Boaz thirsted after righteousness as he treated Ruth, the sojourner and the stranger, with dignity and with love. Ask yourself, are you thirsting after righteousness in all that you do? Are your desires and ambitions and behaviors in line with God's plans? You might say, I don't know, are they born out of love? Well, that's a pretty good checklist in 1 Corinthians 13 to apply it by. We have to confront ourselves. We have to ask ourselves, how loving are we and how loving can we be? We have to ask ourselves individually, and we have to ask ourselves collectively, is our nation thirsting after righteousness? I'm serious, folks. We have to ask ourselves, if Ruth was alive today and she came to this country in desperate need of food, clothing, and shelter, would she be taken under the wing of a modern-day Boaz? We hope she would. There's plenty of good people out there. But it's possible that she may, instead of encountering love, it's possible she could hear taunts in the street, like, go home. It's possible that she'd be in danger of being deported to Rwanda by our government. In a world where the vulnerable are too often left to fend for themselves, we must confront ourselves as individuals and as a collective and ask, how much integrity do we have? And in turn, how much integrity is there within us for God to work with? Because to some extent, God's work here on earth depends on our cooperation. As I said, we have free will. We can use it for good. We can use it for bad. Because he's given us free will, we will have wayward tendencies that we must keep an eye on, like self-righteousness, pride, greed, selfishness, callousness to the plight of others. And all of those things put obstacles in the way of God's perfect will to help all of humankind. God was able to protect Naomi through Ruth's integrity, and God was able to protect Ruth through Boaz's integrity. Ask yourself, what can he accomplish with your integrity? What can you give rather than get? Just as Boaz invited Ruth, and I'm going to finish up in a minute. Just as Boaz invited Ruth into a safe place where she was nourished, loved, and protected, God is inviting every single one of us into a safe place too, just like Boaz's field. But God's field is God's kingdom. And just as Boaz said to Ruth, don't glean in another field, Christ is asking the very same thing of every one of us today. Christ wants to claim you as his own. You may think that you can find freedom on your own, but I'm here to tell you, friends, there is a true and better freedom. Just as there is a true and better Ruth, a true and better Boaz. It is Jesus Christ. If you take one thing from this, my friends, and this is my last line, don't glean in another field. Christ has everything you need. Amen.